Hello, I'm Lori Vanderploot from Kent ISD. Today we're going to cover a few IEP tips for parents, and then we're going to have a discussion at our PACE meeting on Monday night. So the first part of the IEP talks about student strengths and parent concerns. And this is a very important section for parents to be able to articulate some of the concerns they have regarding their child's educational progress or social progress within the educational environment. So it's important that they are able to identify and have listed in the IEP concerns that can be taken into consideration as the IEP team looks at the development of the content of the IEP. So I want to first talk about the present level of academic achievement and functional performance section of the IEP. This is actually the foundation of the IEP, or what I call the heart of the IEP. The present level statement actually drives all of the IEP decisions that will be taking place. So when we look at the development of goals and objectives, we look at the accommodations under the supplementary aids and service section. We look at the programs and service needs of the student. We look at transportation. We look at extended school year services. All of the areas of the IEP are driven by the needs that are identified in the present level statement. I think it's important for the parents to understand that the present level needs are identified based on the eligibility needs of the student that are identified in the evaluation process. And there could be other educational needs that are also identified in the IEP process that the student may require some specialized instruction that could be supported through programs and services. But when we look at the development of the PLAF statement, it should include some baseline data and specific sources of that data for each identified area of need that the IEP team has data available to support. We also look at a description of that need that would be specific enough that it would give the IEP team and also the implementers of the IEP a starting point for instruction. So where is the student presently performing? What are the current needs that would drive the development of the goals and objectives that could start that specially designed instruction that would be provided through the programs and services. And then another important section of the present level statement is really looking at how is that need that has been identified impact the student's ability to participate and make progress in the general education curriculum, work toward the attainment of their goals and objectives in their IEP, also any of their post-secondary goals, and for children who are in the early childhood programs to be able to participate in age-appropriate activities. So we need to know what the impact is of that need so we know appropriately how to address and support the need as we go through the development of the IEP. So let's talk a little bit about goals and objectives and benchmarks and how those are really looked at in the IEP. So to have a goal, it needs to be meaningful, it needs to be measurable, it needs to be able to be monitored by the staff who are providing the instruction and doing the data collection of how well the student is progressing toward the attainment of those goals. And it needs to be identified in an aligned way to the needs in the goals or in the PLAF statement. So again, that it needs to align with the identified need in the PLAF. And it may align with the grade level Common Core state standards or the essential elements that are also identified in the Common Core, so that there is the connection between the grade level work of the student and the identified needs that drive the instruction. So a measurable goal, it should have an ending date for when that goal would be achieved. It should talk about what the behavior the student is able to demonstrate, and behavior could include the learning behavior that the student would have to have. So example for in relationship to a reading or writing or a math need. The level and the degree of the condition that the student is going to be able to perform, and how the mastery will be evaluated. So the development of the goal statement needs to be inclusive of all of that information. So here's a little model that we have put into place that's kind of been given to us by the Michigan Department of Education. So the example would read, by March of 2015, which would identify your date, after determining the problem and solution of a paragraph from a fiction or nonfiction, that would be the skill and the behavior text, Carol will be able to make 3 inferences about the theme or message of the paragraph 4 out of 5 times. So your 4 out of 5 times is really looking at your condition and your criterion, and it's going to be measured by informal reading assessments, which is really how you will be assessing and evaluating. So to have a measurable goal, it needs to be inclusive of a date, the skill and the behavior, the condition and the criteria, and the assessment and the evaluation. So benchmarks versus objectives. Benchmarks and objectives are kind of the intermediate steps that will assist the student in accomplishing the goal. So we've written our goal of what we want the student to be able to attain within the annual IEP year. And then in Michigan, we still have the 2 short-term objectives or the 2 benchmarks that would align with the goal. And so a benchmark is time limited and it builds mastery of an annual goal, where an objective is an individual skill that must be developed in order to reach the annual goal. And we can talk a little bit more about those. Once the goal and objectives are identified, or the goal and the benchmarks are identified, we have to look at what would be the evaluation procedure and the criterion and the schedule of evaluation that the staff will follow. So let me talk a little bit individually about each of those. The evaluation procedure is the method the teacher or the service provider will use to assess the progress. So for example, documented observation, it could be some student work samples, it could be teacher-made tests, it could be curricular assessments, it could be curriculum-based measurements. So how are they going? What is the procedure that they're going to be using to be able to start collecting their data? Then we will be looking at the performance criterion. And when we're looking at that, we're looking at it either under a rate or a percent. So the rate could be 8 out of 10 times or 4 out of 5 times or 2 out of 3 times. And those are really for observable behaviors that we would be looking at. Typically within the social work, sometimes within the OT area or the PT area. And then you have another option of really looking at the percent of the mastery, and we often align those with some of our academic goals. And then lastly on this goal page is the schedule of evaluation. And sometimes we get that a little bit confused as to when the information, the schedule that the parents would be provided the progress data. This is actually the schedule of how often the progress data is going to be collected to really show whether the student is working toward the attainment of that goal and objective within the timeline that's been identified. So oftentimes IEP teams need to, 1, look at their goal and objective, and then need to have a conversation about how often does the data need to be collected based on that individual goal and objective to be able to determine and be able to measure whether or not the student is progressing at an expected rate. So do we need to have some daily? That might be very challenging to collect. Do we look at weekly? Do we look at bi-monthly, or do we actually look at a monthly type of a schedule? So those are an IEP team decision would be to the schedule. That's how often staff are collecting and retaining the progress data toward the attainment of the goals and the objectives. So let's move on to progress reports. The progress reports are actually a copy of the goal page that is sent to the parent as often as general ed report cards would typically be sent home. And so for each goal page on your child's IEP, you should be able to see whether or not your child is progressing toward the attainment, if they have progressed and attained that, or they're maintaining the particular skill, or they're not progressing at an expected rate. And we'd like to see some comments. Where is the child progressing in relationship to that rate or that criterion? And a little bit of description of where they are in relationship to the attainment. And so it should report on all benchmarks or objectives that are on the current IEP team report. So another component of the IEP that I really want to discuss, I think is important for parents to have some understanding of, is the section called Supplementary Aids and Services. And this is where we need to look at some of the special factors, some of the behavioral supports a student may have, some communication needs, the need for some assistive technology. That section also is to identify whether or not there are training or support needs that the school personnel need to have in order to address some of those special factors. And then most importantly, we look at, are there accommodations that the student really requires in order to progress toward the attainment of their goals and objectives, or to progress within the general education curriculum. And we have to identify the frequency, the timeline, and the location in which each one of those accommodations will be delivered. So, what is the intent of looking at some of the accommodations? It's really to give the student a level playing field so that they have equal access to the instruction in the curriculum or the environment. It is not to give them an advantage or an unfair advantage over other students. And when I look at the accommodations, it's really not what the student would benefit by. A number of students in our districts could benefit by some oral testing or by having some extended time on some work, but it's really based on the eligibility needs of the student. What does the student require in order for them to be able to have that equal access to the curriculum? And then those would be identified under the Supplementary Aids and Service section. So who identifies those? It's really under IDEA. The role of the gen ed teacher is to really look at how is the disability of the student impacting their ability to progress within the classroom, and then what would be some reasonable accommodations that the student may need to have in place in order for them to be able to progress at the expected rate. So special ed teachers and related service providers can also make some recommendations of some other accommodations to ensure that that FAPE offer is an appropriate offer, but it's typically the general education teachers who would be making the recommendations of the impact of the need and what accommodations would help level that playing field. So I've covered two sections for you in this quick brief little module, one being the present levels section and one being the supplementary aids and service or the accommodation section. So what I'm hoping that you will do now would be to generate a list of questions that you have and come prepared to our PACE meeting to engage in some conversation around these IEP tips so we can offer any clarification, give some further examples, and have a rich conversation. So thank you for attending, and we'll see you at PACE.